Hello, today I'm going to talk about the Great War course. I'm going to go through the various different aspects of the course and hopefully explain all the different parts to it. And using this, you should be able to complete the form on the Google Classroom that asks you to rank the different aspects of the course in terms of how well or how unwell you understand it. So there are 4 different sections to the Great War course, and that's the same for all of the history courses, that there are 4 parts. And the first part is Scots on the Western Front. So this basically deals with the experiences that Scots faced when they were actually fighting in the war on the Western Front. So the first part looks at recruitment. So what factors led to Scots signing up to join the army? So basically, why did they join? What was it? And so that's to do with posters and propaganda campaigns and PALS battalions and the White Feather campaign and those sort of things. And then we look at life in the trenches. So what the trenches were actually like for soldiers and how they coped with the conditions that they faced. So that's water and rats and mud and all those kind of things, and diseases and clothes and those sort of aspects of the war. We look at military tactics, so the actual way that the war was fought. So you look at things like creeping barrage and mines and all the different tactics they used, or going over the top, those kind of attacking and defensive tactics, and how effective or ineffective they were in terms of helping to win the war. And we look at technologies, so that obviously links into the military tactics bits, but we look at the different military technologies that were used to help fight the war. So we look at gas and tanks and artillery and aircraft and machine guns. We basically look at the effectiveness of them in allowing soldiers to basically kill the enemy. How effective were tanks in killing the enemy, or how effective was gas in terms of killing the enemy. And we also kind of think about the effect that these things had on the Scottish soldiers. So they obviously suffered from gas and facing machine guns and things like that. So it is quite a good summary of the different aspects of the war itself. So that's the first part of the course, looking at why Scots joined and what they faced when they did join. The next section looks at the World War II and World War I in terms of its effects on society in Scotland and culture in Scotland. So first thing we look at is DORA, so the Defence of the Realm Act, an act that was introduced in order to give the government control over the population. So we look at why it was introduced, what it did in terms of the different things that it prevented people from doing, about censorship and going certain places and going to pubs and those kind of things, and how the different terms of the act were viewed by the public in Scotland, and obviously a lot of them were very unpopular in various different ways. We look at rationing. So we think about why rationing was introduced obviously due to U-boats and the various campaigns and some problems with harvests and those kind of issues. And we look at the various things that were rationed and the effect it had on the Scottish population. And we look at conscription and conscientious objectors. Conscription is just being basically forced to join the army, and a conscientious objector is someone that refuses to be conscripted. So we look at why conscription was introduced, which groups were conscripted, and the various reasons for conscientious objectors opposing conscription. And finally, we look at the way that World War I changed the role of women from a cultural point of view. So we look at how their lives began to change, how they were allowed, or it became acceptable for them to do a lot of things that they hadn't done in the past, such as going to pubs or going out alone, staying out late, spending their own money, and how that kind of changed the perception of women and the extent to which that kind of percolated or continued throughout society. And then the next thing we look at is the industry and economy, so how World War I affected the Scottish industry and the Scottish economy. So the first thing we look at there is war work, so the various industries that kind of developed because of the war, obviously the main one being things like armaments, but other ones, shipbuilding, coal mining and things like that, and the role that women played in these various industries. Obviously women had to take over a huge number of jobs because men had signed up to fight, and so these roles had to be filled. And we also look at the various reserved occupations. And reserved occupations are just jobs that you could not be conscripted from, so jobs that were seen as very, very important, such as if you were a key man in a shipyard, or if you worked in a coal mine. Those sort of things were seen as very important. We also look at the impact on fishing and agriculture, how farming in Scotland changed, how fishing in Scotland changed, obviously with the U-boat threat limiting and the use of boats in the Royal Navy obviously significantly limited the fishing opportunities, but farming massively grew because there was a real push for Britain and Scotland to grow a lot more food. Then we look at the post-war situation. So during the war, there was a huge amount of demand for the various things that Scotland produced, coal, steel, ships. But after the war, there was a huge decline in this, and this led to a massive loss in terms of jobs and various places of work. And as well as being caused by World War I, there were also a lot of other factors that contributed to the decline in Scottish industry in the 1920s. So we look at them, and then we look at the new industries that began to replace some of the old traditional heavy industries and the success that they had. And some of them had quite significant success, but generally speaking, a lot of the new industries that developed in the 1920s didn't particularly take off in Scotland, and so there were not a huge number of success stories. And the last thing we look at, section 4, is politics. So that's how the political landscape changed due to the war or during the war. And the first and probably the most important thing is votes for women. So we look at the campaign for gaining women the suffrage, and suffrage is just another word for gaining the vote. That began prior to the war, and the effectiveness of these campaigns and the various different methods that were used. So obviously looking at the suffragists and how successful they were. We look at other factors that contributed to women eventually being granted the vote in 1918, and then we can extend that to look at the extension of voting rights at large. So we look at the different groups that were given the vote in the 1918 Representation of the People Act. Obviously it extends the suffrage, the right to vote, to not just to women that hadn't had it before, but also quite a few men, or a significant number of men who hadn't had the vote before as well. Then we look at rent strikes. During the war, a lot of landlords in cities like Glasgow had increased rents, and they thought it was an opportunity to begin to charge more people more money. And the campaign to fight back against this, that was eventually successful and undermined the rent rises and forced government and landlords to kind of back down and accept that rent should be kept stable during the war. And finally, we look at homes fit for heroes, which is a very famous phrase that was used by the government, by the Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who said that, you know, the returning soldiers should be given homes fit for heroes. They'd gone out, they'd fought in the war, and they shouldn't be made to come back from the Western Front and live in the slum conditions that a lot of them had to endure. So he promised to these. And the extent to which this promise was delivered, it was pretty limited. Some people said that it's not so much homes fit for heroes, but you had to be a hero to live in some of the homes. And so this promise in many ways was broken. So they are the 4 different topics. There are 4 different sections in each of the Great War course, and I've broken down each of the sections into kind of 4 bits. So there's 16 questions on the little survey, and what I would like you to do is just answer that survey, and hopefully that will give you an idea of how good your knowledge is in some places and maybe the areas you need to improve. And also, if you fill it in, then I'll have a good idea of how the kind of overall direction of the understanding is, so that it can maybe give me an idea about where to focus some lessons when we come to do some lessons on this over the coming weeks. As ever, if you have any questions about any of this, please do just ask.